Thank you for joining us for our June Q&A talk. I am tonight's host, Q&A Talks Program Coordinator, Cody McRae-Cullum. My personal pronouns are he, him, but if you're feeling bold, please feel free to address me with my preferred pronoun, the royal we. Q&A Talks connect rural parents and caregivers of LGBTQIA+ youth with the resources they need to ensure their children can grow up safely and authentically. Q&A Talks is an initiative of Project Q&A and is made possible by grants from the Independence Era Community Chest and the American Library Association's Libraries Transform Communities Focus on Rural and Small Library grant in partnership with the Independence Public Library. Tonight, we are pleased to have DC Hiegert. DC Hiegert is an attorney and LGBTQ+ legal fellow at the ACLU of Kansas, where they work to protect, enforce, and expand the rights of LGBTQ+ Kansans. DC is a lifelong Kansan and enjoys pet pictures, Johnny Cash, and the farmer's market. Please welcome DC Hiegert.
Thank you, Cody. Happy Pride, everybody. Nice to be here doing the Q&A talks again and doing it in June. One of my favorite times of year. So we're here to talk about your rights as LGBTQ+ Kansans. I'm going to do that with the guide of some PowerPoint slides. So I'm pulling up my screen right now. Just want to make sure, yeah, I got a thumbs up from Cody. So it looks like that y'all are able to see what's going on here. So I'll just put the, here we go. We can get rolling. Yeah. Okay. Got a heads up. Cool. So today I'll back up real quick. We're going to be talking about, your rights. And I'm going to be doing this a little bit differently than I usually do my Know Your Rights presentations. I'm starting with a bit of a like high school government class breakdown, just because I think that in this specific moment in time where there's a lot of anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans policy attacks happening in our state houses and potentially maybe in your local government and your communities. There's a lot of confusion and fear going on around what our rights are and what rights are changing or potentially being taken away by what's happening in these spaces. And I want to kind of that's a valid concern for the community and something that we should be, paying attention to in this moment. And I want to remind folks that we get our civil rights from all sorts of places, from the U.S. Constitution, from federal laws, and from within our states and communities. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a breakdown to remind us of all of our rights and where they all stem from. Just to kind of ground us in where we're at in this specific moment. So with that, we can jump in, and I'll be first talking about in this little kind of government 101 part, talking a little bit about this concept of preemption and just sort of a civil rights 101. And I should say for folks that might be on the live, we'll have questions at the end of the presentation, opportunity for discussion afterwards. So I'll just be kind of going through the slides, and if there's things that pop up in your mind that you have questions about or want to talk a little bit further about, we'll have an opportunity to do that at the end here. Okay, so with that, let's talk government. So I know this is a really, really rudimentary level breakdown here, and I should ask real quick, can y'all see my little camera? Like, can you just see my screen, or Cody, do they see our pictures as well? Because my picture will be blocking the text if people see that.
It's you're minimized at the top, but we can still see your face while your screen is open. So yeah,
okay, cool.
We can see the slides as no, not at all. No.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thanks, Cody. As we navigate the fun internet world. Okay, so levels of government. I think this is something that, if we paid attention in our basic government 101 class, we know this. I don't want to insult folks with things we already know, but I just think it's important, like I said, to have a good understanding of where all of our rights flow from and what's going on in this moment when there's sort of a changing landscape. So just a reminder of, not only do we have 3 branches of government, but we have 3 levels of government. So we have the federal government, And the three branches there, administrative, which is, the president and all the administrative agencies, the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, all that stuff. And then we have the legislative branch, which is our US Congress. And we have the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court of the United States and the federal courts. And then, that applies for every level here. So at the state level within Kansas, we have each of those branches and their own respective state systems, like Governor Kelly and the Kansas Department of Education, for example. And as you go down the chain, the same thing continues to happen at the local level. Within your own city, you have a mayor and some level of municipal agencies, and you might have a city commission, county commissions, school boards, and all of these spaces have the power to either issue laws or create policy that protects LGBTQ folks. And so that's why it's important to kind of have this backdrop when we're going into this discussion. So with that, just kind of a little bit deeper dive on where in these levels of government our civil rights can flow from. And I think this is basic level stuff, but I want to start with these building blocks as we go into the Know Your Rights talk. And so, as I said prior, at the federal level, we have, the US Constitution and laws that get passed from the US Congress. And then also those federal agencies can issue policies or regulations that have protections for LGBTQ folks. And then the same thing as we go down through every branch of government, Kansas Constitution and the Kansas legislature can create LGBTQ rights. Same with administrative protections from agencies under our governor, like, for example, Governor Kelly, during her administration, the Kansas Department of Children and Families had a policy that was issued that was LGBTQ affirming. And the same thing at the local level, your city council can issue a municipal ordinance that protects LGBTQ plus individuals from discrimination in your locality, or they may have administrative or policy protections in different spaces. And so that's sort of the backdrop of all these areas where your civil rights can flow from, and the three different levels of government. So now is where there can be a wrinkle in this situation, and this is kind of more relevant to the moment that we're in now in Kansas, and how other folks are feeling in other states across the country that are facing anti-LGBTQ legislative attacks. And so we're going to talk about this concept of preemption. So there's this clause in the Constitution that's called the Supremacy Clause. And it's essentially language in the US Constitution that makes clear that that Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And along with the federal Constitution, federal laws, generally laws that are passed by the US Congress, take precedent over any other laws and policies that are happening at the lower levels of our government. And so why am I giving you all of this government education? Just because it's relevant when, say, a state is passing an anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ law, to know in our heads, what happens if a state law is in conflict with a federal law. If a federal law says it protects me in a certain area and a state law is trying to take away my right in that area, what happens? Who wins? That's why the Supremacy Clause and this concept of preemption matters. And so what I was just describing, when maybe a lower level government law and a higher level government law conflict, is this specific type of preemption called conflict preemption. There's different kinds of preemption. I'm not going to get into a whole like law class lecture on preemption. Y'all don't need to do that. I already had to sit through that, but we're just going to focus on the specific thing that's relevant to this LGBTQ plus Kansans know your rights conversation, which is conflict preemption. And so a little bit more deep dive into understanding what conflict preemption is. This, like the example I gave on the last slide, conflict preemption, it's something that arises when laws, policies, or constitutional clauses in different levels of government, say the federal government and your state government, or your state government and your municipal city government, when those things conflict with each other. This is when this concept of conflict preemption comes in and says that, the higher level of government will win out in that context. If there's a state law that conflicts with the federal law is supreme. But that also applies if there's a municipal, a city ordinance that conflicts with a state law, the state law is supreme. So it's just sort of like up the ladder in that sense. And so I have some examples on the slide here that specifically narrate what I'm describing. I don't want to over explain the point, but so what I was describing with state and federal, say, imagine a scenario where a state adopts a law that explicitly removes protections from, LGBTQ individuals' ability to seek housing, and it allows for discrimination at the state level in that context. Well, there's a federal law called the Fair Housing Act that explicitly protects LGBTQ people from discrimination in housing. And so where that federal law applies in Kansas, if the Kansas state law explicitly conflicts with the purpose of the federal law would win out and your rights would still be protected under the federal law. And so that's just one scenario. I have another scenario. We don't have to go through all of these, but that works in the opposite as well. And what I mean by that is, say you live in a city that has a city council that wants to protect LGBTQ people's rights. This is probably a better example done in the context of when if folks are familiar with the concept of sanctuary cities for immigrants, and there have been cities in Kansas that tried to adopt at the municipal level policies that would protect that population of individuals in Kansas. And the state legislature wanted to essentially stop cities from being able to do that. And so they adopted a law that said that cities could not have policies along those lines that were more protective than what the state law had. And so that's kind of a convoluted way of getting us to say that the state has the ability to preempt cities from being, more protective of a certain set of rights than what state law is. So even though in the context of a state law being bad and federal law being good, conflict preemption is sort of beneficial, it also works in that opposite framing. And I just think it's important to note that when we're navigating these spaces where each level of our government might be trying to either protect LGBTQ rights more broadly in Kansas or attack LGBTQ rights in a specific way, it's important that we have this kind of understanding of what happens at all these different levels. And so I just wanted to start with this sort of breakdown before we got into the know your rights discussion. I'm sorry for the unnecessary government lesson that y'all didn't sign up for. But just real quick, the part one takeaways that I hope you got from that is that, as a reminder, in case you slept through that high school class, there are 3 levels of government and each has their own 3 branches, and your civil rights and policy protections can flow from each of these spaces. And then, as a reminder, because of the supremacy clause in the Constitution, we have this concept of preemption that says rights flowing from our federal Constitution and the federal government generally, all those agencies at the federal level cannot be taken away from state action. But that also means that rights or limitations on those rights flowing from state governments can't be taken away or expanded by local action, depending on, the framing you have at that level. So that's the real quick backgrounder on levels of government and an intro to preemption. So with that, we're going to get talking about kind of the meat of what we came here to discuss today, which is, just actually knowing your rights as an LGBTQ plus Kansan. And so I'm going to talk again, since we did this nice, lovely intro and have this understanding of the levels of government. I'm going to be talking about initially all of our federal protections that are flowing from the US Constitution and from federal statutes that have, laws that have been passed by the US Congress, and then talking about our state and local protections, just so we kind of have that background as we go into the discussion. And I should say, I'm going to do sort of a high level overview of a bunch of kind of broad areas of LGBTQ rights, and essentially just every aspect of your life, that we have the potential to experience discrimination and that we have some level of protections for. We're going to be just going a broad level on that. And if people have more specific questions about one area or the other, we can talk a little bit further on those topics at the end of the presentation. So with that, let's start with employment and your rights to be free from discrimination in the employment context. So we have protections that flow. I should say all my slides are going to specifically be talking about federal laws or potentially court decisions that talk about LGBTQ rights in this specific context. And there are also rights that flow from the Constitution in all of these contexts as well, but they pretty frequently are the same rights flowing from the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, and due process clauses. And so I just didn't include that on every slide, but I want to remind folks, we always have our constitutional rights, and those are the most supreme when we're thinking about preemption. So don't forget about those. But okay, now with that backdrop, employment and your federal statutory rights. There's this federal law that's called Title VII, commonly referred to as Title VII. And it is the law that provides anti-discrimination protection for employees of employers that have 15 or more employees. It applies to any employer that falls under that category, as long as they aren't specifically a religious employer that has some carve-outs because of their First Amendment religious freedom rights. So Title VII applies to a large number of employers, and it protects employees from discrimination on the basis of sex. And in a recent Supreme Court decision called Bostock v. Clayton County, which was a case that was joined with a few other cases of individuals experiencing discrimination in their workplace, either because of their sexual orientation or because of their gender identity. And the Supreme Court said in that case that Title VII, because it protects from discrimination because of sex, also protects from discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity. And so that means that LGBTQ plus individuals are protected from discrimination because of their LGBTQ plus identity at work, and cannot, be fired or harassed or anything because of these identities. And so that is the law of the land as it sets. The Title VII, the language of the statute itself, hasn't been amended to specifically say sexual orientation and gender identity in the statute, but because of this Supreme Court decision, Bostock v. Clayton County, what do we have, a tongue twister? it has been interpreted to mean that because of sex means protection of those identities as well, that sexual orientation or gender identity. And so that's where, our rights stand in that context, and you are protected from discrimination in your workplace if you fall under Title VII. And I just want to flag, I have on all of these slides and the topics that we're going to be covering a little bit of information about if you do experience discrimination in violation of one of these federal statutes. Typically, the federal agency tasked with enforcing that statute will have some sort of complaint process that you can access online, and some sort of investigatory structure in place to investigate the complaints and help you with your experience of discrimination in whatever context it may have occurred in. And so in the employment context, there is an entity called the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and it investigates the complaints of workplace discrimination under Title VII. And if you go to the EEOC's website online, you can look at facts about what Title VII protects you from, how to file a complaint, and even various different assistance on filing if you go to that website. I don't have all of the URLs. Usually I have it linked, but I know y'all can't access that from Facebook Live. But if you just Google EEOC complaint process, it will likely be the first link. Okay, so let's talk about housing. So I mentioned this in one of these laws I mentioned in one of my examples earlier, talking about preemption. But in the housing context, there are a few federal laws that protect LGBTQ individuals' rights. And so there's one federal law that's called the Fair Housing Act, and that bans landlords and housing providers from discriminating against renters or homeowners based on perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. So again, that protects, LGBTQ plus individuals. And I will just, for the sake of me being able to talk a little bit more smoothly, I'm going to teach everyone one of my very favorite acronyms, which is SOGI. So when I say SOGI, I'm saying sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. And expression. So that's just like a fun little acronym for the various different classes that LGBTQ plus individuals may fall into for having protected identities. Anyway, so SOGI, if you hear me say that, that's what I'm referring to. So we have the Fair Housing Act that provides those SOGI protections. And then we also have this thing called the Equal Access Rule. And what this is a rule that requires that LGBTQ plus people have equal access to housing programs that receive HUD funding. And HUD is another one of those agencies at the federal level of the government. And so this is a policy rule that ensures queer and trans folks can access the programs that are getting those federal dollars without discrimination. And then again, in the housing context, I want to flag that HUD has this specific office that's called the Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Office, and it does the same thing as EEOC in the employment context. FHEO investigates complaints of housing discrimination. And same thing here as far as resources. I'm going to point you to the FHEO website, which has the same setup. You can access facts about what protections exist under, what protections exist when you're seeking housing and how to go about filing a complaint online with them in that context. All right, now we're going to talk about healthcare. And I know that this is something that's on folks' minds because it's one of those areas where there's been legislation, trying to attack specifically trans folks, gender diverse folks' ability to access gender affirming care. Luckily in Kansas, Governor Kelly's veto was sustained. And so trans folks that have the access and privilege to receive gender affirming care still have that ability to do so in Kansas because that law luckily did not pass. I know we're in the federal landscape. I just wanted to flag that because I know it's something that's in the front of folks' minds. So when we're talking about healthcare, there is this specific section of the federal law called the Affordable Care Act, section 1557, and it creates protections from discrimination. And it applies to most healthcare providers that receive federal funding. They have to comply with section 1557 of the ACA. And the discrimination clause in that section bans providers from discriminating against patients based on SOGI, so that protects LGBTQ plus people. And section 1557's protections extend, got a little typo there, it should be a D, but extend to state-run health programs, as well as any entities that are receiving federal funding for their healthcare programs. It also goes to these state-run programs like Medicaid and Medicare. So that is important to know as well. But I will flag that religiously affiliated healthcare providers, just like how I was saying, religious employers have a carve out from their discrimination requirements in Title VII to a certain extent. The same thing exists in the healthcare context. So religiously affiliated healthcare providers do not have to comply with all of the provisions of section 1557. Excuse me. And so, what that means is, in Kansas, at least, what that means for us here is that we need to kind of be aware of the landscape, because many providers in Kansas, just like many other states in the heartland and in the South, many healthcare providers are religious in nature or have some element of religious affiliation that end up allowing for some of these carve outs from responsibility to avoid discriminating against LGBTQ plus people. And so that's just something to be aware of as we're navigating this space. And I know in certain times it's unavoidable when you're accessing the only provider. If you're in a rural area, oftentimes some of the only providers in those areas are religiously affiliated. And I should say that there has been continued legal advocacy in this space to make sure that while religious entities are able to have the ability to operate, they still are providing all of their patients with the best standards of care. And that means not discriminating against LGBTQ plus people and providing them with all of the care that they need. And that applies in other contexts as well, in the bodily autonomy context in general, when we're thinking about women's rights and reproductive freedom. So I should say, while some of those carve outs do exist, that is a landscape that is being argued back and forth with, and there are legal advocates pushing for more protections in these spaces. But it's just something that, when we live in a state like Kansas, we need to be frank with what the landscape looks like and naming that as a challenge. So with that backdrop on healthcare, I do want to also flag that just like in the other contexts, the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level investigates complaints of discrimination in healthcare settings from providers that receive these federal dollars to make sure that they're complying with Section 1557 and their obligations under the law. And so you can access the Health and Human Service HHS website for facts about protection under this section of the ACA and how to file a complaint online, just as well as the other places. And I should say, for individuals that maybe are less comfortable with online spaces or don't want to file complaints online, most of these federal agencies have the ability for you to call someone over the phone to do a complaint process or to do a physical complaint submission via mail. If the tech world or doing a digital complaint isn't something that makes you feel comfortable. All right, so with that, we'll talk about education. And this is, I know, a landscape that I think a lot of folks are paying attention to, especially because there was a number of anti-trans laws that passed from the Kansas legislature this year that apply to LGBTQ, specifically trans students' rights in Kansas schools. And so that's why I think it's important that we're starting with this federal background approach to this and reminding folks that because of the supremacy clause and preemption, your constitutional rights from the U.S. Constitution and your federal rights from federal laws take priority. You know what I mean? And these rights will protect you regardless of what we're talking about, later on. And so there's a number of different federal laws that protect LGBTQ plus students in schools, and in schools that receive federal funding. So public schools, or, specific charter schools that they're receiving federal dollars, that type of thing. And I will say, as a reminder, like I said at the top, there's also obviously your U.S. constitutional rights, your 14th Amendment equal protection rights and due process rights. Students have First Amendment free speech rights, freedom of expression and assembly, and those things all apply in your education context as well. And so I'm just reminding you of those very important constitutional rights and what the ACLU really cares about your civil liberties in those spaces, but I think the ones that folks forget about are these other, or don't know as much about, are some of these other more hard to navigate big federal laws and things like that. So that's why I like to flag those too. And so along with your constitutional rights that you have in a school setting, you have these federal statutory rights. And so Title IX is a law that if you have heard of it, that people know about Title IX in a bunch of different contexts. Sometimes they think of it as this law that protects women's ability to play sports in different settings, and some people think of it as a law that people know it from different ways. But what we're talking about Title IX for in this context is that it is the federal law that protects you from discrimination because of sex in any education space that's receiving federal funding. And so this is important to flag because although it doesn't explicitly say SOGI in the text of Title IX, it does say that it protects because of sex. And so we remember that Supreme Court case Bostock that said the employment law, Title VII, because of sex, protects SOGI. That is where the interpretation of Title IX is headed in the education space as well. So the Biden administration issued an interpretation in 2021 of Title IX that it said the because of sex provisions in Title IX protect SOGI in school. That law was challenged in court by a number of conservative state AGs, or that interpretation was challenged. And so that doesn't exist in Kansas in this moment. But after that happened, then in 2020, the administration, the Department of Education, I should say, proposed a change to Title IX that would explicitly include those SOGI factors in the text of Title IX's protections. And that rulemaking is, they've closed the public comment on it, and it's anticipated that we'll get the final rule on that Title IX SOGI piece in October of 2023. So this fall, we're likely to see another step towards more firm protections for LGBTQ plus people in the Title IX context. And I should also say that there's a number of federal court cases that have interpreted Title IX as well as constitutional rights to protect LGBTQ plus students from discrimination in the school context. So then I'll just go through real quickly with, there's a few other ones I want to flag. There's something called the Equal Access Act, and that protects queer and trans students' rights to form an LGBTQ plus student group, something like a GSA, to protect, and then it protects those groups from not only being able to be formed, but it protects them from unequal treatment from other clubs in your school. So, if you or your child is wanting to start this group or having trouble with the group from administration, that's something that you have rights, and you should be able to advocate for yourself or for your student in that context. And then I also want to flag FERPA, which is a federal privacy law that protects LGBTQ plus students' privacy rights. And so this means that schools can't share a student's medical history or their gender identity without the student's permission. And so that's important as we're looking at some of these policies that are popping up from school boards and things at the local level. And then again, just want to flag that the Department of Education has something called the Office of Civil Rights, and it investigates complaints of discrimination under Title IX. Their website has the same resources of facts and a process of how to file complaints if you experience discrimination in the education setting because of your queer trans identity. All right, and then I want to touch on ID documents. So at the federal level, you have a right to change your name and gender marker on various federal records, including your federal passport or your information with the Social Security Administration. Those two are, I think, the most prominent or relevant, I think, in people's day-to-day lives. And various other federal IDs as well. And you can visit the US State Department's website to figure out how to update your federal passport. And they do allow for X gender markers on federal passports for non-binary or gender diverse individuals that want that option. And then the Social Security Administration's website has the same information on how to update those ID documents with the SSA. And then I want to flag credit and financial practices. This is something that I think people don't think about as an area that you need protections in, but it's certainly important that people know you have protections from discrimination when accessing certain credit services. And there's a law called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that protects from discrimination in this context. And after Bostock, that Title VII case came down, the federal government expanded this ECOA so that it also bans discrimination based on SOGI in credit transactions. And same thing, I want to point y'all to, there's so many fun acronyms when we're talking about the federal government. So I'm sorry to be overwhelming you with a bunch of letters, but there's an entity called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And it handles complaints of discrimination in credit transactions. And you can visit their website for FAQs, sorry, that's what that slide should say, about the ECOA's protections and the complaint process as well. And then finally, I want to flag the individuals who may be held in incarceration facilities have protections for their LGBTQ plus identities as well. There is a law called the Prison Rape Elimination Act, also called PREA, another fun acronym for y'all. And this law has a set of national standards that are issued for how incarceration facilities can make sure they're complying with it. And those standards protect specifically trans individuals' right to not be held in a gendered unit strictly based off of their gender assigned at birth. The standards require that these spaces make decisions on a case-by-case basis and seriously consider your gender identity as a trans individual when making this housing determination. And then I also want to flag that there's Eighth Amendment protections from cruel and unusual punishment that apply to LGBTQ individuals when they are held in incarceration facilities as well. And I do just want to point folks to ACLU National and the ACLU of Kansas's websites for additional prisoners' rights information. We have a lot more information around not just LGBTQ folks' rights, but just your broad rights and how to stand up for your rights while in incarceration settings. So with that big, broad backdrop of all of your federal rights from the US Constitution and all of these federal statutes, I want to quickly touch on your state and local civil rights and protections as Kansans. And that should say your state and local like rights and policy protections. But this is a little bit harder of a conversation because we're in this changing landscape where there have been some anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans laws passed in the Kansas legislature, and potentially, one law, SB 180, that has been referred to as the quote unquote Women's Bill of Rights, has some language that it's yet to be seen how it's going to be implemented at various state agency levels. And so I can tell you right now, what the current state of Kansas LGBTQ protections are, and just with that caveat of there are some laws coming to take effect, and this landscape may be changing. But currently there's a state anti-discrimination law called the Kansas Act Against Discrimination, CAD, if you want another acronym for you. And this slide is chock full of them, so don't worry. And then there's an entity called the Kansas Human Rights Commission, and that is the state agency that is tasked with handling complaints filed under CAD, the state anti-discrimination law. So it's the same thing I've been describing throughout this whole presentation, but just now at the state level of government. And so CAD has the same language as these federal laws. It protects from discrimination because of sex. And after Bostock was decided, the KHRC issued a policy statement saying that CAD, its language, it's because of sex language, will be interpreted the same as Bostock interpreted that language in Title VII. So synthesized out of all that legalese, what does that mean? It means that currently in Kansas, even though CAD doesn't have that SOGI language, it's the policy entity tasked with enforcing CAD interprets it to protect LGBTQ plus people from discrimination. And so at this moment in time, the KHRC accepts complaints of LGBTQ discrimination under CAD, and individuals can visit their website for information on how to know what your rights are under this law, and also how to file a complaint that will get investigated with KHRC. And then removed from the state anti-discrimination law, just like when we were talking in these federal contexts, there can be state administrative policies that protect LGBTQ rights in various spaces. So, for example, the Kansas Department of Revenue that handles our driver's licenses in the DMV. I know we don't think of them as like doing great thing, like, we're always kind of sad when we're thinking about the DMV. Though I will say it's been great, but a lot better experience when you use like the online sign up process. I just had to get a new ID, so that's fresh in my mind. But anyway, so KDOR has a policy that allows for trans folks or gender diverse folks to change their gender marker on their driver's license. And so that's a policy that, protects LGBTQ folks in Kansas. And so all of these different agencies can have affirming policies, or the governor's office can issue executive orders that protect LGBTQ folks, like Governor Kelly's executive order protecting state employees from discrimination based on SOGI. And then a reminder that this can also happen at the municipal level. Your city can have a non-discrimination ordinance that protects LGBTQ plus people specifically, or municipal agencies and local level policy, like a school board, can issue an affirming LGBTQ policy. And so that takes a little bit more digging based on what community you're in Kansas. I will say that there are 19 cities and 18 cities in one county, Wyandotte, that has LGBTQ plus inclusive non-discrimination ordinances. And you can look that up to see if you're one of those cities on a website called LGBT Movement Advancement Project. They have a breakdown of those protections for each state in the country, including Kansas. So you have these protections at the state level, and then depending on where you live in Kansas, you may have some additional protections at the local level. But as a reminder, these things can kind of change as policy or legislative action changes in this space. But remember that no matter what happens in this space, this doesn't change your federal rights or your constitutional rights that we talked about, throughout the majority of this presentation. And so with that, I will stop doing my history lesson and legal explainer and open it up for questions or discussion if folks have anything they want to talk further about.
All right, thank you so much, DC. And I will continue the discussion on Zoom for anyone that wants to show up for the private discussion. So far, we don't have any questions in the comments section on Facebook, but I'll keep my eye on that as well.
Sounds good.
Yeah, all
You want me
right.
to stop sharing my screen here?
Yes, please, if you could.
Yep,
Much appreciated. All right.
will do.
All right. Thank you to all who tuned in and to our partners at the Independence Public Library and our funding sources, the Independence Area Community Chest and the American Library Association. Thank you to DC Hiegert for a wonderful presentation. If you would like to continue the conversation with DC on Zoom, follow the link in the comments. Be sure to tune in next month for Q&A talks. We will be talking to Paige Olson on Wednesday, July 19th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. And Paige will be discussing voting rights. If you would like to find out more about Project Q&A, our work, or to view past Q&A talks, visit our website and follow us on social media. To support the work we are doing in rural communities, please consider making a tax-deductible donation today. Thank you for watching our Q&A talk this month. If you have any questions for our presenter, follow the link in the comments. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.